So, did strippers really help make this car legal? Well, actually they kinda did, but they also kinda helped make it illegal. It depends on how you look at it. Just let me explain. The R34 Skyline is one of the, if not the most widely known and sought after vehicles ever made. It is so coveted, especially in the States, that when one does come up for sale, it's common for them to go right up to 200 grand just for a standard GTR, and all the way over $500,000 for special edition cars. Now, I'm sure most of you know by now, but the reason they sell so well in the US is because they were never allowed here. But it's weird because once in a blue moon, you'll see one pop up for sale in the US, and it says it's road legal, but how is that possible? It hasn't been 25 years since the first ones were made, so it can't be street legal, right? Well, usually these GTRs have one word associated with them: Motorex. And not only does that hold the key to them being allowed stateside, but it also holds one of the craziest automotive stories filled with everything that makes a good story, from fights, drugs, guns, gambling, and everything in between. So let's see how the name Motorex became so infamous, and how the hell they managed to get R34 GTRs into the US. Now, in order to understand the story, we need to cover two things. First is the R34 itself. See, the R34 is the third in line of what most GTR enthusiasts would consider the holy trinity, the other two being the R32 and the R33. Now, there are other GTRs like the R31, but these are the ones that most people are after. The R34 though, that one was made famous not only by its legendary power plant, the RB26, which is known for being so highly tunable that it has been documented as taking well north of 400 wheel horsepower on stock everything. All that they did was turn up the boost and put on a new tune. But it's also been made famous by the big screen, a little known film. It's kind of indie, I don't know if you've heard of it. It's called Fast and Furious. Yeah, not only was it in those movies, but in the second one, the protagonist, Brian O'Connor, played by the Paul Walker, yeah, the R34 was his main ride. Now, while those were certainly main factors, it isn't like the car didn't deserve every bit of praise that it earned. That RB26, paired with its manual transmission and all-wheel drive system, ensured that even in bone stock form, it was going to smoke any and all competition. Whether it be on the street or the track, it was going to do it anywhere on Earth at any time. Now, after all of the insane praise that the GTRs got, it's no wonder everyone wanted to get their hands on one. However, for American enthusiasts, there was a pretty big problem. See, Nissan never intended to sell the R34 in the States, and since it wasn't sold here, it brings me to my second point. It wasn't actually legal to buy an R34 in the States, thanks to the 25-year import law. Now, a very brief crash course. In the 80s, America was known for a lot of things, but making quality vehicles was certainly not one of them. This includes both cars and motorcycles. See, in the 80s, sport bikes took off in the States as fast as, let's say, well, a sports bike, and it left American marquee Harley-Davidson on their ass. So instead of fighting fair and making better bikes, they begged and pleaded with the US government to help them, and help they did, placing extremely steep import tariffs on imported sport bikes, causing prices to rise and giving Harley a leg up against manufacturers like Honda. Now, American car dealerships took notice of this, and they wanted their taste. See, at the time, what would happen was gray market distributors would buy something like, say, a Mercedes or a Nissan for, let's say, 30 grand, and sell it in the US for 35 grand, when that same Merc or Nissan would cost 40 grand here through a dealership. It's just an example, but you get my point. So seeing that the government would step in, car dealerships began lobbying Congress hard to pass laws to ban imported cars, and so they obliged. So in 1988, a law was passed banning the import of any vehicle into the United States that was 25 years or newer. So now that you know the story behind the thing keeping the R34 from coming to US shores, I hear you. Then how the hell did they even get here if they aren't allowed? Well, like most laws, there are loopholes and exceptions if you can fork over enough cash. See, the government wasn't going to ban you from importing cars, you just had to do something called federalizing them, which consisted of bringing them up to US crash and safety and emission standards, which if you've ever dealt with anything from the US government, you know was inevitably expensive as all hell. Now, it's almost impossible to do on your own, so companies started popping up offering to deal with the headache for you, obviously for a price. That's where the name Motorex comes in. See, Motorex started importing these R34 GTRs in 1999 and retrofitting them with things like airbags and taking them to crash tests and etc. And it worked. As once news hit the automotive scene, they began taking orders like crazy. See, people use this term a lot, but I don't think it could be understated how this had effectively turned into a money printing factory. Now, the entire process of federalizing one of these GTRs was very time consuming and extremely expensive. It required the car to be shipped all over the country for different crash and emission testing, all of which had to be certified by the US government, which meant more money spent and mountains of paperwork. The whole process could quite literally end up taking a year from the second Motorex took delivery of your GTR to the second that you got your GTR. And this doesn't include things like the time it took to ship to the US and clear customs, which if anyone knows takes an extremely long time. Anyways, all of this meant that margins were paper thin, and seeing as how they were a new business, Motorex didn't have the experience necessary in order to run it efficiently, which led to early failures like leaving certain cars at crash and emission test sites and forgetting about them entirely entirely. Kind of a big issue, seeing as after everything, these cars at the time could be valued at up to 200 grand. With that steep of a price tag, it's no wonder that by 2002, people began hounding Motorex asking where their car was, how long it was going to take, and more. And keep in mind, they couldn't even keep track of their personal cars being crash and emission tested. How do you think they kept track of customers' GTRs? The answer is that they obviously couldn't. And that, paired with customers just not understanding the fact that the process to federalize a GTR could take up to a year, put immense pressure on the CEO, Hiro Nanahoshi. Sorry for butchering that. Anyways, this led to two things. First, Nanahoshi gave the okay to start just sending Skylines out, with or without the federalization complete. It didn't matter. He just wanted pressure and congestion eased up. And second, he began visiting hostess bars, which if you don't know, thinking kind of like Hooters, but on steroids. And he began simping hard. One time he spent the modern equivalent of 44 grand on a car for some random chick, which was money neither he nor Motorex could afford to spend. Remember, they had paper-thin margins. Now, even after just throwing Skylines to customers without federalizing them, they still weren't moving them quickly enough. And soon, fed-up customers began calling everyone, local police, DOT, FBI, you name it. If they were in charge of something, they got tipped off. However, by this point, the DOT had already begun to suspect something from Motorex, as they would get massive amounts of paperwork in waves, with certain parts of paperwork and certain pictures as well being 100% identical to other imported cars, which obviously did not add up. So in 2005, not only did the DOT ban the import of any Skylines built after 1999, they also gave Motorex an ultimatum: prove you federalized each and every single one of the Skylines or face punishment. Now that his actions were catching up to him, Nanahoshi began to frequent the hostess bars more and get hammered just about every day. He began losing weight and abusing all sorts of different drugs. He was obviously desperate. His final Hail Mary attempt came when some young guy came into Motorex flexing cash, and he somehow convinced him to come on board and give them an undisclosed amount of cash. All we do know is that it was a lot of money. But by this point, the DOT, working with the LA County Sheriff's Office and the FBI, had discovered undeniable proof of at least 17 R34s in the US that had not been federalized. Sensing the feds were on his ass because, well, they kind of were, he started chopping up all of our favorite cars like Skylines, RX-7, Silvias, and more, and selling their parts to make a quick buck. And remember that new investor from before? Well, turns out as he was leaving the hostess bar that the CEO also happened to frequent, he got jumped. He got tased and beaten to a pulp for 2 minutes straight until bouncers came and chased the two attackers off. And it later turned out that the two attackers were Nanahoshi, the CEO, and a very close confidant of his. Nanahoshi fled to Reno, Nevada, and was later tracked down by US Marshals. And according to the feds, he beat this kid up because he was cooperating with police. He was charged with a ton of crimes, some of which included extortion and kidnapping. He later fled to Japan, where he's suspected to be hiding to this very day. All of this left a pretty large issue though, as there were around 70 total Skylines between the R32s and up to R34s, and a good chunk of those weren't legal. So, in an extremely rare form of government generosity, the US government allowed the Motorex GTRs to stay on the roads, and they wouldn't be impounded and crushed. This is due to the fact that the owners of said GTRs bought them in good faith, as they thought the cars had been federalized, and it wasn't their fault that the cars were not federalized. And these are the Motorex GTRs. These are the cars that, even though they aren't legal on paper, they all come with very special paperwork saying that the DOT has given them the green light to stay. So, did hookers really help get the GTR banned in the US? Kind of indirectly, I guess. Although I would say it's obviously definitely more Hiro's fault, as he was kind of the one, you know, running the whole thing. But to be fair, what do I know? I'm just some dumb kid talking to the void we call the internet.